Welcome to part 2 in the Geography of Groceries. I'm Sandy Larson, who wrote this, and Star Pelsu is our tech genius bringing you the pictures. And at the end, for those of you who are here, Gail McKibben, our prop lady, has organized a spice smelling of various mixtures from China to Jamaica, because everybody spices up their life. And our talk today is about the world's oldest multi-country big business, spice trade. And there is probably nothing more ordinary to you than those little jars in your kitchen shelf of cinnamon, nutmeg, and ginger, and maybe the pepper and the salt. Everybody has them. And you even, if you go into a rental place, you'll even find them left behind. Somebody doesn't care. They leave you the cinnamon, the pepper, the salt. It's no big deal. A little shake, and we don't think anything about it. But are they really that innocuous? Are they that boring? If they are, why do we all say the spice of life or spice up your life? Why do we wax poetic over sugar and spice and everything nice? And why do we say variety is the spice of life? And we even have a porn channel called Spice. So the English word spice that we are using comes from the word special. And special comes from the word species, which is what differentiates and identifies one thing from another. Species was actually the original Roman word for spice. But as the Roman Empire declined, species became attached to any item of high value and low volume, anything easily transportable and transferable for a profit, as opposed to common bulk. In other words, something very special, and thus something that a king could place a tax on. And in the 5th century, Alexandria in Egypt was taxing white peppercorns, cardamom, and cinnamon to fill its treasury. Spices were so special that people actually bequeathed them to their families in their wills. They used their conspicuous consumption to flaunt their wealth and their power, and they traded them as cash in what in those days were barter systems. Actually, in 408 AD, way back, when Alaric, who was king of the Goths, sacked Rome, he demanded as part of the ransom 3,000 pounds of black pepper. Pharaoh Ramses II was buried in 1224 BC with a peppercorn in each nostril, because spices were symbols of paradise. They were signs of royalty, triggers of fantasy, and those peppercorns did not come from Egypt. So there was already in 1224 BC a trade, a world enterprise. In fact, because spices came from somewhere far away, somewhere mysterious that most people couldn't get to, they kindled our Western fascination with and fantasies of the exotic Orient, the East, which is where spices came from, and our fascination lingers on. In the sordid world of human behavior, and in the impurities of food, water, and our plagues, spices were thought to be something that came from heaven, or the Garden of Eden, because they were untouched by all of this filth. They have an aroma, not an odor. Buddhist monks' robes in that shiny, deep yellow color are meant to imitate the color saffron imparts to your food to make it special. Spices are mentioned in the Bible, in the Song of Songs, a lyrical tribute to love. Because they seem so otherworldly and so heavenly, they were used for incense and as burnt prayer offerings that luscious aroma, not an odor or a smell, thought to be something that would attract the gods to where you were. And they were the temptation for which you did not have to have guilt. Rome spent so much of its gold on spices that it had to compensate for its depleted treasury by conquering and taxing new lands or finding gold mines somewhere to keep paying for the spices it imported. Spices could be consumed in edible forms, or you could breathe them as incense or perfume in a room. The aroma wafted through houses that were fumigated with these burning aromatics as a kind of predecessor to our aromatherapy. Churches were permeated by the aroma of resinous spices, especially frankincense, that was used in the celebration of Christian liturgy. These symbolic overtones put on spices linked fragrance to health and to sanctity. And the holiness of saints was demonstrated often by the wonderful odor of spices or aroma of spices that they would exude in life, and even contrary to the usual reports, they supposedly exuded these beautiful aromas in death. Medieval legends that have come down to us tell us the three magi who visited the newborn baby Jesus were kings of Oriental realms, and thus, naturally, what did they bring as gifts to the baby Jesus? Spices, frankincense and myrrh, along with gold, as signs of tribute and worship, which means wealth and sacredness. The Bible, remember, tells us Joseph's jealous brothers sold him into slavery. To whom? To a traveling spice merchant. So this was already a big worldly business way, way back. They were special spices because they could conceal the taste of meat that had been salted for preservation and often went a little rancid. They were used as medicine. They are still used as medicine. You know, people tell you that cloves will kill the pain of a toothache. Turmeric is antibiotic. Fenugreek makes mother's milk flow. Ginger calms nausea. How many of us have had surgery as kids and were off to ginger ale when you woke up from the anesthetic? How many do take ginger before you get seasick? Piquant flavors stimulate our salivation, and they also promote our digestion. Pungent spices, and this is important, cause sweating. And that may cause a cooling sensation. It's like air conditioning. You sweat out the humidity in your body and you feel cool. And this is why the hottest climates eat the hottest food. On the other hand, spices for us in a cold climate can add a sense of inner warmth when they are in cooked foods. And so we do use them in the cold weather. Cinnamon will heat your body in the winter. In the summer, it's used to repel ants, keeping them off your food. And on top of all this, if that isn't enough, spices just make your food taste damn good. And that's why the merchants of Venice made all their money importing 500 tons of spice a year. When you consider when you go to the market and buy 1 ounce, how much that is, you can imagine what 500 tons of this powder is. So there is probably nothing more earth-shattering in your kitchen, nothing that has done more to unify, tear apart, diversify, and change the world we live in than those seemingly innocuous little shakers of cinnamon, black pepper that are on your shelf. Spice seeking and spice trading is what brought Europe and Asia face to face, caused the discovery of the Western Hemisphere, let us not forget. Columbus sailed the ocean blue looking for the shortcut to black pepper. And it led to the commercial dominance and the imperialism of Europe that is now coming to an end. But before I get into how all this happened, it's important to understand that an herb is not a spice. An herb is more or less the leaf of a green plant that grows and you can cultivate it like a vegetable. So in a sense, all the herbs are pretty similar in that they are plants, parsley, rosemary, sage, basil, and so forth. But a spice is something altogether different, something unique and often really bizarre. And that's what makes it special. Spices have no commonality except that they all come to us from hot climates in the east and from some part of something else that grows there. You may not know that cinnamon is the inner bark of a tropical tree. Nutmeg is the pith or stone of an inedible tropical fruit that grows only on some remote islands in the Pacific. Mace is the skin of that pith. Cloves are the dried buds of an evergreen tree native to and known only on 5 atolls in the middle of the Pacific. Saffron is the stamen of a small crocus that has to be coaxed out by tiny hands. Ginger is the rhizome or tuberous bulb or root of a flowering plant that is no longer wild because it has been cultivated for so many thousands of years. The rhizomes are often available to us in the market, but more commonly we get it dried and powdered. And the same is true for turmeric, which is a rhizome, but mostly we get it dried or powdered. Many spices are seeds of those growing green herbal plants. And my question for you to think about is, who figured all this out? We think globalization is us with our cargo planes and container ships and GPS and sonar and FedEx. But think about this. In the remains of a ceramic urn in a house on the banks of the Euphrates River, a house that burned in 1721 BC, archaeologists found clothes, which are only native, as I said, to some atolls in the South Pacific. Archaeologists also found evidence dating to 1450 BC of cinnamon in Egypt. True cinnamon being native to Sri Lanka. In the 3rd century BC, people in Mesopotamia, that's what we would call today Iraq, were using cardamom. In the famed epic, you know, 1001 Nights, which dates from somewhere in the 8th or 9th century, Sinbad the sailor says, and I quote, "We ceased not to buy and sell at several islands until we came to the land of Hind," which is India, "where we bought cloves and ginger and all manner of spice." The determined pursuit of spice is what got the earth discovered and mapped. For several millennia, that meant Europe, where spices were sold, to the Far East, where they were brought to market. In other words, this big global business was already going from Europe to Asia 5,000 years ago. Later, as we're going to see, getting spices led to the discovery of our whole new world. Their pursuit also led to the discovery and harnessing of the seasonal trade winds that blow between Africa and the Far East. In other words, Europeans were trying to figure out how fast they could get to the east to get the spices, and they learned to harness and watch the winds. Before the discovery and harnessing of these trade winds that made getting there a bit faster, the sea trade was dominated by an Austronesian people of Southeast Asia. They were ancient Indonesian sailors who by 1500 BC had established routes from South Asia to Sri Lanka and India. Their goods were then transported overland by Indian and Persian traders toward the Mediterranean. What the 19th century called the Silk Road was at its inception the spice trail, and spices went back and forth with silk. So this was a huge global business. By the 1st millennium AD, this Austronesian maritime trade had expanded to the Middle East and Eastern Africa, resulting in the colonization of Madagascar. But they now had competition. The kingdom of Aksum, which is today Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Sudan, was founded in the 5th century BC, and it pioneered a Red Sea, quicker maritime route. And thus Ethiopia became the maritime trading power of the Middle East because it could get the spices faster. Determined to get to the spices of India with great haste, the Romans then attacked the Aksum's Red Sea ports and reduced the city we know as Aden to rubble. That secured the Roman Empire until the rise of Islam, which was with the fall of Rome. Arab traders started plying these maritime routes and eventually dominated them, spreading Islam as they went, which is how it got as far as Sumatra, which is a source of spice, and as far as Tanzania, which was a purchaser of spice. So the globalization is really nothing new. The spice merchants in all these ports where spices were landed were an ethnic mix of Sephardic Jews, Phoenicians, Egyptians, and Byzantines, who today we would call Syrians and Turks. Their commercial networks stretched from the Black Sea to Barcelona. Byzantine spice traders lived in Canton, China, and Sephardic Jews prospered in the spice trade in Cochin, India. And there is still a group of Jews in India who are called Bene Israel. The languages of the spice market were Hindi, Latin, Hebrew, and Syrian, which may have been Arabic. Again, it was big business. About 2,000 years into this business, that's 2,000 years, we come to the Middle Ages with the market now cornered by the Arabs, who very conveniently lived between the point of origin, the Far East, and the point of sale, the West, as in Europe and North Africa. And that's why Europeans began to call the Arab lands the Middle East. By the way, when I say Arabs to you, I am not talking about Saudi Arabia, but the entire swath of this planet occupied by people whose native language is Arabic. The Persian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Fertile Crescent from Iraq to Egypt and across to Morocco. That was the Arab-speaking world. During the Middle Ages, most Arab-speaking peoples adopted Islam, either voluntarily or by the sword. In the jealous eyes of European Christians who were now paying a fortune for their special spices, it was to them thoroughly Islamic. And we know how Europe's Catholic crusaders felt about anything Islamic. The Crusaders set forth not only to liberate Jerusalem, but they had commercial ambitions to get to the spices too. But they would have to wait a few hundred years to achieve that, and then they did. Europeans understood somehow that nearly all the spices they craved and paid a lot for were coming from somewhere in Asia. A few got added in the Middle East, namely saffron from Persia and cumin, which is thought to be native to Egypt. But where the main spices came from was a mystery, and they wanted to solve it. And the sooner the better, because on their long voyages to the European marketplaces, spices had to pass through many ports, and that meant many merchants, and that meant many, many, many markups. And so the Europeans were trying to figure out how to do direct trade, kind of like going straight to Costco, the wholesale warehouse. And then there was what we might call the advertising or the hype, which is nothing new. In the 5th century BC, in Greece, Herodotus reported all the imagined perils that were involved in harnessing spices. Flying bats, carnivorous birds, tree-hugging snakes, all the stuff of our horror movies. In what country, he said, cinnamon grows is quite unknown. The Arabs say the dry sticks are carried by large birds, which use them for their nests, on top of mountains too high for man to climb. And that made them seem so special they had to cost even more. It wasn't until the 1st century AD, when the Romans had muscled their way into the spice business, that Pliny the Elder set the record straight. He said, these old tales were invented by the Arabs just to raise the price of their goods. Sound like a familiar corporate strategy you have heard? So not much changes, and the spice trade will teach us that if nothing else does. When the Renaissance dawned, liberating Europe from the tight hold of the Roman Church, the royal powers also wanted to be liberated from what they saw as the oppression of sky-high spice prices set by Islamic Arabs and Venetian merchants who seemed to be in league with them. And yes, the wealth of Venice came in good part from the spice trade. The resentful crown heads wanted the spice jewels for themselves. And they wanted direct access, not just to the fish somewhere here in the West that they heard about, but to those spices somewhere in the East. The European colonization of America is simply the story of Christian persistent effort to get rid of the Islamic middlemen and buy spices directly from the source. First out of the port, looking for a passage to India that did not pass through Islamic territory, were the Iberians, Portuguese, and Spanish. And today we have Portuguese Goa off the coast of India and Macau off the coast of China. And we have Japanese people eating bread they call pão, which is the Portuguese word for bread because the Japanese never had wheat bread until the Portuguese brought it. The Spanish took the Philippines and then Central and South America. They got the latter, Central and South America, because as soon as the Spanish Catholics chased the Islamic Moors back across the Mediterranean, liberating Al-Andalus, southern Spain, Andalusia, in 1492, the newly enthroned Spanish crown hired a Genovese mariner named Cristoforo Colombo, told him, go find a way straight, direct, and fast to all those spices coming from India. Now remember, this was before Google Maps and GPS and satellite navigation. The routes to the east had long since been well mapped. All cargo ships coming out of Europe had to go south along the entire coast of Africa and then around the Cape and sail east with the trade winds now across the entire Indian Ocean. And so this contrarian Colombo tried sailing west right from the get-go, and which is why when he bumped into the Caribbean islands, he thought he was somewhere near India. And he said, I'm in the west of India, because it was broken into so many land masses, so many little islands. He said, this must be the West India, the West Indies, which is also why we still call Native Americans Indians, because Columbus was very mixed up. The Spanish crown was dead serious about getting to the origin and monopolizing the spice trade. Columbus failed 3 times to return from these Indies with anything resembling the spices of India. And he ended up in disgrace and for a time actually in jail for failure. But of course, we now know that inadvertently he discovered far greater treasure than anyone would ever have imagined. Treasure that radically changed the world in ways Ferdinand and Isabella could never have imagined. What Columbus discovered instead of those spices was potatoes, tomatoes, corn, beans, chili peppers, chocolate, vanilla, and so much more. The next time you enjoy your French fries or a bowl of chili, thank Ferdinand and Isabella for sending Columbus to get them cinnamon and black pepper. Columbus wasn't the only navigator who got dispatched. The other famous sailors in our history books on the voyages of discovery, Vasco da Gama and Ferdinand Magellan, only became discoverers or explorers to us because they also were paid to go get the spices. And for a moment, it did look like the Catholic countries, Spain and Portugal, frantically dispatching these explorers were going to win the spice wars. But the newly Protestant North quickly rallied, and by the late 1500s, Dutch and British boats finally found Asia. More ruthless, more violent, and more determined than the Iberian predecessors, these guys ignited wars until they were victorious in monopolizing the origin land of each spice and bringing them cheaper to their own markets. This paved the way now for commoners to enjoy what royalty had been eating. The Dutch committed genocide to clear the Molucca Islands where cloves and nutmeg originate. They then transplanted some trees to other territories they conquered in the Indonesian archipelago, which is why we get things from Sumatra, and the West Indies, which is where they've come to us today from the original Dutch-held islands. England's dash for spices started only after its armada finally defeated the Spaniards and was able to rule the sea. On December 31st, 1600, it formed and capitalized the East India Company, which may sound familiar, which provoked the establishment of a Dutch East India Company in 1602 and the start of empire rivalry. The Dutch had already seized the Indonesian archipelago. The Portuguese had a few islands, including Japan. So the British went in for the kill and conquered India itself, setting up what we know as the Raj. The British East India Company became a business that was actually the main and only contributor to England's royal treasury, and a commander also of a vast army of soldiers that was needed to protect all its holdings. So what was this fierce competition, this charms race all about, really, in the end? Let's leave it there and look at the spices themselves. As I said, some of the most common and cheapest are just seeds of a plant. Those would be cumin from Egypt, coriander, caraway, cardamom from the North Hills of the Himalaya and around Sikkim, and fenugreek. Those are seeds of a plant. Mustard is the seed of a plant too. It can be yellow or dark, brown or black. It is one of the oldest spices we have on record. I say that because we know that Gautama Siddhartha, who became the Shakyamuni Buddha, 2,600 years ago, and there is an apocryphal story about his comforting a woman who comes to him in tearful hysterics. Her child has just died, and she demands that he justify this, explain how such a horrible thing can happen. And the Buddha looks at this woman with great sympathy for her suffering, and he says very quietly, "Bring me one mustard seed from any house that has never experienced death, and I will explain." Of course, the woman could not do that. Lesson learned. But what this story tells us, back then in Eastern India, everybody had mustard seed in their house. Actually, as a spice, mustard appears in Sanskrit manuscripts even earlier than this, around 3000 BC. As the condiment we know, meaning those seeds have been smashed and processed into what we call Dijon mustard, it dates back to the early Romans. Some of those jars in your cupboard are antique. Maya, the French mustard, was founded in 1747. Hallman's is the British mustard, which was founded in 1814. And Grey Poupon, you may remember from its ads, which is French, was founded in 1866. France is legendary for the Dijon mustard because Dijon is the area where that plant grows prolifically. Mustard continues to be such an invaluable spice. I'm going to bet everyone listening to this talk has a jar somewhere in their kitchen. I think I'm right. Nobody doesn't have mustard. We may not have the seed, but we have the processed version. Mustard seeds, if you have them, you're not wrong to have it. They are an antioxidant and they contain sulfur. That's the pungent taste you get. And we know that sulfur is a powerful antibiotic and antimicrobial. Those seeds also contain hard to find B vitamins, vitamin C, and vitamin K. And those seeds are as good for you as their siblings in the field, kale and broccoli. These plants are all related and we just eat the seed of the mustard. Another tiny seed you are not paying much attention to, I will bet, except when you order your bagel, is the sesame seed. In its seed form, it is technically a spice. It is a winter warming spice. Sesame seeds are the most treasured seeds on this earth. They are the most prolifically produced and the oldest harvested seeds in the world. A drawing on an Egyptian tomb 4,000 years ago depicts a baker putting sesame seeds in the dough. Today, as you know, bagel bakers around here are doing them on top of the dough. And so goes McDonald's. Ancient Greek soldiers carried sesame seeds in their pockets as energy-boosting emergency rations. And the Buddha clearly said that during his ascetic fasting, the only thing he ate was 2 or 3 sesame seeds a day, and he did not die. Sesame seeds come in many colors. Arabs prefer the light-colored ones that we know, but the Asians like the black seeds. In a minute, when we look at spice mixes, it will show up in vital ones, the black seeds. African slaves, brought sesame seeds with them. They called them bene in Africa, and they are still here and remain a distinguishing ingredient of Southern cooking. And you can still buy bene wafers in boxes. And if you don't think people treasured sesame seeds, do you remember? By the first Christian millennium, sesame seeds were so important to Arab culture. Scheherazade in 1001 Nights, what was the famous, she said to open the treasury, open sesame. This was not considered a creative coup at the time, nothing so original, we would be talking about it today. It won this role because those 2 little words, open sesame, so famously chanted by Ali Baba to gain access, remember, to a cave packed with riches, speak for thousands of years of human delight at the sight of a sesame pod bursting with a pop that sounds exactly like a lock being sprung, and that releases immeasurable nutritious treasure, all those sesame seeds. The most trafficked, sought after, and to you and I, the most banal spice in anyone's kitchen, more boring than even that sesame seed on your bagel, is the black peppercorn. That is the star of all spices. It is the dried seed of a tropical climbing jungle vine, who figured that out, found only on the southwest coast of India, the Malabar coast, made legendary by pepper seekers. Pepper, that plant is not so easily transplanted and has only made it one other place, I believe somewhere in the Indonesian archipelago. And so to get black pepper for 4,000 or 5,000 years meant you had to get to India. And the world has been doing that all this time. The Romans were there by 200 BC. Why? Why was everybody there? Why were the Romans fighting? Because the black peppercorn is antibiotic. But more importantly, the chemicals in this dried berry encourage your stomach to produce hydrochloric acid. And that is the main component of the gastric acid that will break down your food. In other words, black pepper not only makes meat taste better, it makes meat easy to digest. So when you shake some pepper on your dinner tonight, please remember this is why Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, along with Magellan and Vasco da Gama, and how the world changed because people wanted to eat black pepper. Human lust for these black peppercorns made a harbor town in the center of India's Malabar coast, Cochin, into a legendarily wealthy spice center. It was a cosmopolitan enclave of Jews, Chinese, Arabs, and European Christians who all lived in harmony with the local Hindus and Dravidians, and they all cooked their own distinct dishes, of course, with black pepper. There are traceable Chinese influences here in the cooking of Kerala, this Indian state part of Cochin, and there is Jewish Indian cooking still going on from people who call themselves Bene Israel. Most have migrated now to Bombay, where you can eat in Bene Israel restaurants, and you can find their cookbooks online. The international enclave of people living in and visiting coastal Cochin for thousands of years has left the Indian state of Kerala far more open and progressive than the rest of India. If you ever wondered why, black peppercorns. In fact, it is still a world trade center for essential oils and spices, meaning black peppercorns. And incidentally, if you and I are calling those chilies pepper, chili pepper, it is because Columbus was supposed to bring black pepper back to the king and queen of Spain. And these chilies had a kind of fiery hot that they thought black pepper added to food. So the Europeans took to thinking that these were pepper. But nobody on this continent where they grew would have ever called them a chili pepper. They were chili. Another spice that comes from a seed is allspice. And this comes not from India or anywhere in Asia. It is something Columbus found in the New World. It comes from the West Indies. And today it is sometimes sold to you as Jamaican pepper. Less common spices that derive from the pits of fruits are nutmeg and mace. Tamarind comes from the fruit pod of a tree. Dried tree buds give us cloves and star anise. Ginger and turmeric are the rhizomes. And the favorite of all our spices, ask any child, cinnamon is the inner bark of a tree. This is why cinnamon is such an effective repeller of ants. As a survival tactic, that tree in the tropics evolved chemicals repellent to the tropical ants climbing all over it. And those chemicals are still in that dry bark you buy as cinnamon sticks. One of the reasons cinnamon, ginger, and nutmeg have always been in high demand is because as they dissolve in your stomach, they raise the internal temperature of your body, something that was critical in the days before central heating. This is why today, in all your Christmas baking, you will use cinnamon, ginger, and nutmeg. Over time, different cultures favored different spices. Some for obvious reasons, like colder climates coveting spices that warmed you up. And more often than not, we would combine them in the same dish, leading to what we now know as spice mixes or spice blends. There are dozens of them, from the very simple Japanese gamasio on every table, which is sesame seed and salt, to the complex 9, 10, 12 blends like Ethiopian berbere. Firstly, gamasio is essentially salt, as I said, ground with sesame seed for a very critical reason. First of all, humans need salt, and they also need protein. And historically, Japan never had enough protein to nourish all its people. But sesame seed, it may surprise you, solved that problem because broadly speaking, That little seed is 25% protein, and it is loaded with zinc, has 3 times more calcium than milk, crucial B vitamins, including folic acid. It even has omega-6 fatty acids, potassium, and as much iron as a piece of liver. So when you grind that up with salt, you are giving somebody a real win. Other simple but not fiery spice mixes in the Middle East are za'atar, which is basically dried thyme, sumac, toasted sesame seed, and sea salt. Caribbean and Latin American adobo came from Spain, is a blend of salt, onion powder, garlic, paprika, cumin, and oregano. There's the very French quatre épices, 4 spices with warming, all warming, white pepper, ginger, nutmeg, and cloves. And in Bengali, the Panch Phoron, which translates as 5 spices, is really a grind up of 5 seeds: nigella, fennel, cumin, celery, and fenugreek. Chinese have 5 spice powder that consists of star anise, cloves, cinnamon, Sichuan peppercorn, and fennel. In Ghana, on the west coast of Africa, the king of spice blends is yaji, made of black, red, and white peppercorns, dried ginger, cloves, chili peppers, and salt. In the Caucasus, the favorite reach for, ajika, is a mix of several red chili powders, garlic, coriander, fenugreek, and marigolds. But there is another traditional spice mix next door in the country of Georgia. That's a fusion of culinary influences from East and West. They will mix basil and savory with fenugreek, cinnamon, black pepper, and cloves, and coriander into kumeli suneli. So what I'm trying to say is everybody got into this, everybody got artistic, they combined them for various reasons. As the Middle East was the spice center of the world for hundreds of years, it has many blends. You have probably heard of baharat because Portland had a restaurant named Baharat. Well, it may surprise you to know that in Arabic, baharat means spices. This means there are many versions of any blend you buy for baharat, just means spices, and that depends on who's making it, an Egyptian or a Persian. Sometimes the spices are toasted before they're ground, sometimes they're just ground. The basics seem to be the most desired commodities of the spice trade, or the baharat biz, shall we say. You can cut back on how much you need by blending with other spices. Black pepper, nutmeg, cinnamon, cloves, cardamom. You mix it with your local cumin and of course salt, and maybe a bit of chili that came from the West, now known as dried Aleppo pepper, which you can tell by its name is the Syrian adaptation of the Central American plant. And this is the sibling of Persian advia, which is a combination of cinnamon, cumin, coriander, cardamom, rose petals, for which the Persians are famous, and black pepper. And there's more from this center of the spice world. From Yemen, the land of zoub, which you could buy ready-made at Trader Joe, we get hawaij, which is a hearty blend of cumin, coriander, black pepper, cardamom, and cinnamon. And you go just across the narrows of the Red Sea, and you get Ethiopian berbere, which is a personal favorite of mine. It has so much in it going for it that I'm guessing it was very, very costly to make, except for the centuries when the Ethiopian Empire ruled the spice trade, and that's when they must have gotten very liberal with it. Berbere is coriander seeds and fenugreek seeds and black peppercorns and allspice and white cardamom and cloves, all roasted before they are crushed and added to western chili and salt and nutmeg and ginger and cinnamon, you name it. You go up the Nile from Ethiopia, and the Egyptians created dukkha, which they toast their nuts and grind them up with sesame seeds and cumin. And these have always been local ingredients. And you go a little across the top to the Maghreb into Morocco, and you get ras al hanout, which is Arabic, meaning just top shelf, like baharat. It means whatever was up on the top shelf, your spice blender put it in the thing and sent you home with it. There is no set recipe except that you have 8 spices plus salt. And those 8 spices, usually the ones on the top shelf, might be cardamom, cumin, clove, cinnamon, nutmeg, allspice, ginger, chili, coriander, black pepper, fenugreek, and turmeric. So you can see how this worldwide demand for spice is still a happening thing. We Americans have our own blends. We didn't let anybody get ahead of us. We have Creole seasoning. We have Old Bay seasoning. You can even buy ready-made pickling spice now if you don't feel like putting your own together. And we seem to have developed a taste in this country for the Jamaican jerks, which is a spice mix of cumin, nutmeg, allspice, smoked paprika, cinnamon, and so forth. Arguably, curry powder is us because it isn't Indian. Indian cooking has a variety of blends, but the most common is garam masala, which in Hindi simply means hot spices. Masala is the Indian word for spice. Unlike the curry powder we have, which we put in the pot at the beginning of a recipe, garam masala is only used at the very end. Just before you serve, you put on a pinch. It consists of spices that pass through all the ports of India: clove, cinnamon, green and black cardamom, cumin, coriander, fennel seed, nutmeg, bay leaf, black pepper. You will note it is not yellow like curry powder. The yellow in our curry powder comes from a lot of turmeric, which is put in, not in garam masala. And in Asia, if you're not careful, people will try to sell you turmeric as saffron. And so the spice trade is still going, and we have here some blends for you to discover. So I want to introduce my sous chef, Gail McKibben, who will introduce you to some of these spices. And we also have a handout of some of the world's spice blends where we tell you what is in them, and you can see it's a page and a half of spice blends. So the world is still nutty for spicing up those lights. Thank you. Any questions?
Awesome presentation. Thank you.
What?
Thank you.
Oh, you're
Awesome
welcome.
presentation.
Well, we hope you'll come next week.
One more. Eating local in May. Oh yeah, next week is our last time, and it's how you can really eat local in Maine. What is authentic, what is inhabited, we've had here. And people, the Wabanaki are now bringing back all their food waste. And so we're getting a really good look at what people ate in Maine and what we eat and what we have taught the world to eat. Distinctly from Maine. So last week we talked about how the world and bring their food here to us, and in the last class we'll talk about how our food from Maine is going out into the world. So I turn this over to Gail, and if you want to go on the back, we have 6 spice mixes from China, 5 spice to Jamaica, jerk, and going through the Middle East in between. And you can get a good smell, and you can pick up a list of all the blends in case you want to buy them. And we do have a spice merchant and a spice blender here in Brunswick, Maine, Griffin Ridge.
Oh, yes.
And there is also a spice store in Portland that will blend and mix called Scordo. So it continues to be a big business. Thank you.